Good evening everyone. I think we'll start. This evening's talk will discuss the very exciting archaeological excavations conducted in advance of the construction of a Cork City Council social housing development at a site incorporating the former Nancy Spain's public house in 2021. The discoveries relate to two separate and very distinct periods in Cork's development and history. The talk tonight will be in two parts. So I'd like to hand over now to Dave Murphy and hope you enjoy his discussion this evening on Barrack Street.
Ciara, thanks very much for those kind words, and I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. Fair play to everybody for coming out on such a dirty night. So I'll just start away and give some context of the site. So as Ciara said, the development site is located, I'll use my cursor here by the way on the screen just to indicate what I'm talking about. So as people know, the development site is located at the junction of Tower Street and Barrack Street. It's within the secondary archaeological zone that Cork City Council have around the historic core of the city. So for planning purposes, generally any developments within this area would have to be archaeologically tested or monitored as a minimum anyway. So that darker shaded area would be the main historic core within the medieval city, or the medieval walled town, and that extends up north and south of the walled town. We may have to look at the extent of these zones now, considering the findings of this excavation, but we'll head off. I'm too far there now. We'll head off and we look at the cartographic review for the area. So initially we have Story's 1690 map. The red circle here indicates the area where the ditch was revealed. This would be 1690, around the time of the siege of Cork, so you can see significant suburban development within the South City area. This would be the first kind of map with good detail of this area. Previous cartographic maps wouldn't have had such detail of this area. The map shows street fronting development along this section of Barrack Street and significant suburban expansion to the south of the walled city, which would be here. Historical records actually indicate that there was quite extensive settlement in this area during the 13th century. The area was known as the Borough of Fate. It was granted to the Bishop of Cork by the Anglo-Normans following their takeover of the city in 1177. So during the 14th century, a series of events such as bad harvests, various rebellions, and the arrival of the Black Death would have led to significant population loss across Cork in general, and Ireland in general, I suppose. So in 1374, the suburbs north and south of the walled city were actually burned and destroyed, so that led to the abandonment of the Borough of Fate and Shandon to the north. So there was significant loss of population in this area, and there was less settlement for a number of centuries in the South Bank area. So Carty's 1726 map then just shows additional plot development in the Barrack Street and Tower Street area. So this is Tower Street extending to the southeast here towards what was originally called Cat Lane, and it extended towards the Cat Fort, which was further down to this direction here. So moving on, we have Rock's 1773 map. The entire development site here is indicated by the red shading. So this map gives a more detailed view of the area's development, and it's also the first to show the commercial market garden operations. You can see here on the map that these operations were kind of widespread around the southern portion of the city, and these market gardens, they operated kind of from the late 18th century towards the early 20th century. As the city expanded outwards, they would have pushed outwards towards the southern and southwestern suburbs. There was actually a large operation near the Loch called Loch Nurseries that was run by the Hartland family, and that's where the name Hartlands Avenue comes from. My own family, in fact, my mother's people had a market garden operation at the end of Magazine Road, where Bendermere Park is now, so just a bit of family history there. But Beaufort's 1801 map actually annotates Sullivan's Gardens, and we can see that the site here indicated these gardens extend right into the site, and we found evidence or traces of this activity within the excavation. So once again, we have the first edition map of around 1840. This is the first map which actually shows the boundary of the site fixed. So the yellow shaded area indicates the entirety of the site, and the second, or the 25-inch map edition of 1900, shows outhouses and sheds along the southern margin of the site. We also found evidence of that later on in the development. So just to show the site prior to the beginning of works, basically this is the backyard area to number 52, the derelict yard area, just strewn with modern rubbish and debris, no evidence of any archaeological features at surface level. So obviously, as Niamh or Ciara was saying, as a result of a Cork City Council planning condition, we, John Cronin and Associates were contracted by MMD Construction, the developer, the contractors, to undertake archaeological testing within the only suitable area within the site, which is in the south-western portion of the site. So following the granting of a licence for National Monument Service, I went in to excavate these 3 linear test trenches in this area. Trenches 2 and 3 were shown to be quite modern, or it was all modern disturbance. There was no indication of any archaeological activity. There was modern surfaces truncating the subsoil. The subsoil itself appeared quite truncated in these areas, but there was no evidence of any features across this portion of the site. But in Trench 1, we had evidence initially of late 19th century activity, and there the outhouses and sheds. This would be a remnant of one of those that they were shown on the 25-inch map edition. So we got evidence of 19th century activity quite high up. But then elsewhere in the trench, we saw a significant depth of garden soil extending downwards. So this was quite different to the 2 other trenches that we had prior to this. So at this point, it was unsure why we had such a great depth of garden soil in this location. So I obviously took an interest immediately and investigated the area at the northwestern end of the trench. So there was just the slightest indication at this point that there was activity at the base of the trench, and you can see this in both photographs. It's very vague, but there was just a slight differentiation in soils. Stone and soil deposits were different than elsewhere. So I extended the trench and went in to investigate manually. So at that point, we did a bit of looking around, and there was just the vaguest indication of a cut. And you will see later what this turned into, but this is the first trace of it. The soil layers, one underlying the other, just evidence of soil deposition in this area. And also, while cleaning back, the strap handle of a medieval vessel, a jug, ham green beeware, which Claire McCutcheon later identified to be ham green bee, obviously from the late 12th to the 13th century. So at this point, obviously, we knew that we had to do further investigation within the area. So we had further discussions with Ciara and with National Monuments, and we agreed to open up a wider 15 by 10 metre test cutting centred on the area where we found the activity. We got the machine back in just to reduce down to the level of the previously revealed activity, and at this point it became apparent the natural subsoil was much higher along the southwestern margin of the site, and here we had a sloping escarpment coming down from natural. That's the level of the natural subsoil where the cursor is there, and we had just cut down into the subsoil and a steep slope heading down, and this continued along the southwestern margin in a northwest to southeast direction. So you can see that there. At this point, it was unclear why we had this cut or escarpment into the natural, so we worked on. It could have been due to many reasons at this point, but as you're cleaning back on the northeastern side of the site, subsoil once again rose up towards the surface. So at this point, it became obvious that there may be a ditch feature in the area. Now, unfortunately, this area was truncated in modern times. The level was reduced down, so we didn't have the same height. As you can see here, we had a much higher level of subsoil on the southwestern side of the ditch, and we revealed subsoil on the northeastern side around this level, so there's about a metre of a difference, but that was modern truncation because of the yard area and various other modern activities. So cleaning up the area, you can see the ditch feature beginning to emerge. You're looking to the northwest now. We revealed a section face in this area. We have the highest level of subsoil along the southwestern margin of the site, and obviously our slope coming back down to this level, and that's the truncated side then on the northeastern side. And a better view here with a better context for St. Finbarr's Cathedral. At this point, it kind of looked like we might be on a natural level of the base, but further examination proved that not to be the case. But you can also see in this photograph a slight curvature of the ditch beginning to come back around to this side. So obviously we were cleaning up the section face. We did a bit more investigation, and it became apparent that what initially we thought to be possibly a natural layer wasn't. There was further soil layers extending underneath this, so this was obviously a redeposited layer. So at that point we knew that we had to do further investigation, and we put in a slit trench along the section face of the ditch where we knew that we had natural subsoil, and followed this all the way down manually to a depth of at least 2.6 metres below the level of untruncated subsoil at this point. So Obviously, these were very tight areas to be working in health and safety and whatnot, so we knew we would have to do more investigation once again. So we went back in. Oh, sorry, I must go to this one now. There's actually another pit feature turned up as well on the southwestern slope of the ditch, and that was shown to be quite a significant feature as well, so we knew we would have to go back in and excavate that as well. So at the end of phase 2, we basically had this large ditch feature encompassing almost the entirety of the cutting. So we went back to CARA and National Monuments for the discussions. We were applied for an amended licence to do more manual excavation within the area of the ditch of the section face that we had revealed. So there's Martin and Alan doing the hard work there, reducing it by hand. And you can see in this photograph there were some very, very large limestone boulders within the lower fills of the ditch, or that's indicating purposeful backfilling of the ditch. We'll go into that in greater detail shortly. So this is the pit feature previously mentioned. You can see a mid-excavation section view of it here and a excavated view here. So this pit feature possibly a cesspit or a refuse pit. It contained a very strong smelling humic material. The feature was there was some charcoal from Context 10, the main fill, hazel charcoal that we retrieved during sampling, and that returned a radiocarbon date of between 1022 and 1157 AD with a median probability of 1096. So as we see shortly, this tallied closely with the date returned for the ditch feature. Now, after all much digging, this is the section face that we revealed for the ditch. The ditch itself measured at least 9.6 metres in width, but was probably wider because the northeastern portion was truncated. So it was 2.9 metres deep below the level of untruncated subsoil and 3.2 to 3.4 metres deep from modern surface level. But obviously there was kind of a infilling there with some modern materials, so it's safer to go from the untruncated subsoil as a measurement. The ditch, again, we got a very good sample from the very base of the ditch, short-lived willow, and that returned a date of 1028 to 1157 AD with a median probability of 1100 AD. So as you can see, both the ditch and the pit returned near identical date ranges, which allows us to be confident that they are secure and accurate dates. Just some more photographs here indicating, just showing this extent of the ditch really. Each one of these bar ranging rods is a metre in length, so you can see the exceptional depth of the ditch. And another angle here, looking towards the truncated side. Originally, subsoil would have extended up further here, but that obviously modern activity had truncated that, which kind of takes away slightly from its full effect. Looking back up to the southeast of the site, these were the fills within the ditch where we didn't manually excavate because the development wasn't going to impact on these fills. These were preserved in situ. Obviously, that's the preferred policy of the department, and we were able to cover these with terrain. We reduced them below construction formation level, and the development, there was a buffer zone put in above them, and then the development happened above these. So these fills are actually retained in situ on the site. You can see the curvation or the curvature again of the ditch in these photographs, starting extending back to the southeast and east. That will become clearer now shortly. So this is our section record of the section drawing in the north, the southeast facing section at the northwest end of the ditch. Context 13 here at the very base was the only real evidence of natural siltation in the lower portion of the ditch, meaning that the backfilling up as far as context 5 here was obviously done quite quickly in an organised effort. Again, we can see these very large boulders that were backfilled into the ditch, signifying an organised effort done cohesively. So context 5 and 6 seem to be a capping layer on these lower fills, and these contain shards of pottery from the 13th century. Above that, we had shards in the garden, or sorry, I should have said that these two fills above, context 5, had a garden soil-like composition, so they seem to be derived from the market garden operations that I spoke about previously. So these layers contain shards of pottery dating from the 17th century onwards. So the nature of the layer suggests that the ditch may have survived as a low linear depression in this area anyway, prior to the commencement of the market garden operations in the 18th century. So this is the plan of the ditch. This is the full 24 metres that we revealed during the excavation. You can see again the curvature of the ditch coming around like this, so enclosing ground to the northeast of it. And it was evident during the excavation that the ditch fills continued on at either end of what we had revealed, so it continued on beyond the site. These are some of the artefacts retrieved from the ditch fills. We have, that was the sherd previously shown, that's the Ham Green B strap handle of a jug. Again, that's late 12th to mid 13th century. We also had Redcliffe ware sherds and Cork type ware sherds, and they all came from the two layers, context 5 and 6, which were the kind of the ceiling layers above the lower fills. Then we had also North Devon gravel tempered ware, which is from the mid 17th century onwards, and again that came from the more garden soil-like layers. This artefact was identified by Dr. Griffin Murray as a ring brooch pin, most likely dates to the 12th or 13th century. It's unlikely that it fell off an individual who was backfilling the ditch and was likely contained within the soils that were used to backfill it, having been previously discarded or lost. It was retrieved during soil sieving of sieving of the soil samples that we took from the lower fill of the ditch. But because it came from the lower fill, again kind of indicates the date of the backfilling of the ditch to be around the 13th century. So this is the plan of the ditch overlaid on aerial imagery. And again, you can see the curvature of the ditch extending along, heading back towards the north and heading back towards the southeast, seemingly enclosing ground to the northeast. And if we were to use that evident curvature, we could extrapolate this type of route, extending further to the north and extending onwards to the east and possibly turning again. So what does it all mean? Obviously I can't make any definitive statements right now based on the limited amount of the ditch that was revealed. But what we do know is that we've uncovered a section of a previously unknown, exceptionally large ditch feature. The dimensions and morphology of the ditch can only suggest that it was defensive in nature. The radiocarbon dates that have been returned place the ditch and the associated pit feature in the latter part of the early medieval period and within the time frame of Hiberno-Scandinavian Cork. Although the historic annals recorded that pre-Anglo-Norman Cork was fortified, went too far there now. Although the historic annals recorded that pre-Anglo-Norman Cork was fortified, no evidence of any defences had been revealed during any of the excavations undertaken prior to this in the area known to have been occupied by the early town, the South Island and the opposing South Bank area. The annals also recorded that Cork was besieged by the Anglo-Normans in 1177, which again indicates that some form of defensive feature existed around the Hiberno-Scandinavian settlement. Recent research by Katrina Gleeson PhD research, suggested that the Hiberno-Scandinavian settlement was likely to be more substantial than previously thought and was more focused on the south bank of the Lee, where there was a concentration of pre-Anglo-Norman churches and there was reference to burgage plots in the historical documents. There are also records of a Hiberno-Scandinavian harbour on the south bank in the area of the present-day Cove Street and Sullivan's Quay area. So if further extrapolation of the ditch alignment was undertaken, it could be envisaged to extend further north and maybe veering to northwest towards Elizabeth Fort, and on the eastern side, possibly coming around towards the previously mentioned harbour. This would enclose an area of roughly 300 metres east-west by 300 metres north-south, and would also provide protection to the South Island settlement, which we know, as a result of Morris Hurley's recent excavations, dates to at least 1070. There are examples of similar sized areas being enclosed by earthen defences in Hiberno-Scandinavian Dublin and Waterford. In Dublin, a pair of large ditches dated to the 11th or early 12th century were uncovered during excavations in the early 90s at the Cormarket site. They were interpreted as representing the defensive line of the town prior to the building of the first town wall. The inner ditch there, which was the more substantial of the two, bore large similarities in morphology and date to the Barrack Street ditch, but our ditch is bigger, so we got one over them there anyway. We can't say that the South Bank settlement extended upslope as far as the ditch, but defending the higher ground above the lower line settlement would certainly make sense. In this case, we have to consider what has been revealed at the Barrack Street site may potentially represent Urban Cork's first fortifying element. The evidence from the excavation indicates that there was a concerted effort to backfill the ditch at some point in the 13th century, a time when the Anglo-Normans had consolidated their power on the South Island, rendering any defensive element obsolete. So that's it for the ditch for the moment. Now, as if that wasn't enough, I decided to go poking around on the site of the former Nancy Spain's pub. We're looking in this photograph down the site to the northeast, so standing in this area here, and that's the area where the skeletons were revealed in the very front, just behind the facade of the former pub. So that area was the area where they reduced it was the greatest depth of reduction on the site. The rest of it was kind of at a level, just at a modern disturbance level. So while monitoring the removal of the concrete floor slab and the underlying base material behind the pub's former facade, a number of bones were revealed immediately underlying the rubble layer. So you can see here, the bones are very high up. These are the initial skeleton remains that were revealed. That's the foundation of the adjoining building, number 49. And we had this rubble layer containing moderate material, and immediately beneath that, the initial bones were revealed. So contrary to some early reporting regarding the discovery, there were no floorboards involved. People who frequented the pub will remember its slate floor, and this was set upon the concrete slab. So following the discovery of the bones, all machine work in the area was stopped. I did some initial clean back and investigation of the bones, and I quickly realised that they were more than likely to be human remains. So I contacted Niamh so she could confirm or inspect and confirm. So once Niamh came to site and confirmed that they were human remains, we contacted the guards, and the coroner and the state pathologists were also contacted, and that's the procedure that you have to follow if you find human remains. So following discussions, all parties were satisfied that the remains were historical in nature, and we applied to the NMS and NMI for a licence to excavate the remains, as they would be impacted by the development. So again, a view of the location where they were found. You can see that's prior to being properly cleaned back, but just inside the door, that's the former door of Nancy Spain's pub. Many people would have passed that. And just here, that's where the initial skeleton remains were revealed. We had another couple of features in the area. There was 2 small pits here that contained just animal bone. They may be from a different period of activity. And you can see here again, that's the initial view of the remains that were revealed. Initially it seemed to be one individual, but subsequent examination by Niamh proved that there was actually 2 here. So, yeah. These were skeletons, yeah, so basically the skeleton remains seemed to be truncated, or they were truncated, by the stone layer extending across the site at the pelvic area, and the stone layer extended underneath the foundation of the adjoining building. So we knew that the building was built in the early 19th century, so we knew at that point that these remains dated to no later than the early 19th century. Just a view of the other pit features that we found in the central portion of the site. They proved to be shallow and contained animal bone that was mostly equine, actually, and they probably are unrelated to the burials that we found. We also found, in that wider area, but from insecure context, we found a 13th century garment pin and some Santonge pottery, so it was just further evidence or further indications of early activity on this site in general. So moving on, we were cleaning back in the rest of the area, and we found more cranial fragments in the northeastern portion of the site. So obviously further investigation was done, and at that point we started uncovering the mass burial pit, grave cut. So this is skeleton 2 being revealed here, and shortly after skeleton 3. So at this point we knew something out of the ordinary was occurring. As you can see, both individuals have their arms placed behind their spine, and there was evidence of further bones within the pit at this point already, so we knew something very significant was occurring. So that's a further view, and at this point we can see the leg bones of skeletons 4 and 5 beginning to emerge, and they were facing the opposite direction than the initial 2 skeletons that were revealed. So here we see the arms of skeletons 4 and 5, both behind the back. Niamh will go into this in greater detail. But all 4 skeletons, obviously within the pit, had their arms bound behind their back, and more likely their feet or their ankle area also bound. So also we noted, it was worth noting that there was a concentration of large stones. I should say firstly that the skulls of all the individuals were heavily fragmented. And this may have occurred due to compaction processes, which could have happened at any time over the centuries due to the shallow nature of the burials. But it is worth noting these stones that were placed over the heads or were positioned over the skulls of the individuals. This may have happened accidentally during the backfilling of the pit. However, they could also have been thrown down in a final act of disrespect after the individuals were placed in the pit. So after a lot of painstaking work, we came to this point. All 4 individuals revealed within the mass burial pit, It was evident that all four had their hands or arms bound in bound position, and the ankles, feet in a position which would also suggest that they were bound. Here we have a mid-excavation view. So this is the mass burial pit here on the northeastern side of the site. This is where the first two skeletons were revealed, adjacent to the party wall at number 49 Barrack Street. We have our stone surface here coming across, which cut the first two revealed burials. And that's the area where the possibly unrelated pit features were. So finally, from me, we have two excellent photographs from my colleague, Colm Chambers. Just on the day, it happened to be a nice sunny day, low light at this time of the year, and whatever way the light was shining, there was an aura within the site. There was no doctoring of these images. They weren't put through Photoshop or anything, but they're the two that probably got the most attention at the time. They really just show the definition of the burials very well, and two excellent photographs, so fair play to Colin for that. So at that point, I'll pass you over to Niamh, who will go into the real detail on the burials, and I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
So many thanks, Dave. Two really incredible archaeological discoveries from two separate periods of our city's history, so fair play to you. So the focus of my talk then will be on the osteoarchaeological analysis of the skeletal remains uncovered, and I'll talk through some of the techniques and methodologies that I use to unlock information about the biography of the individuals discovered. So many of you will be aware that human osteoarchaeology is the scientific study of human skeletons excavated from archaeological sites, and we recover and analyse the bones and teeth that remain, which offer us a unique insight into our human past that cannot be gained otherwise. So what type of information then can this analysis inform us on? So by close examination of the skeletal remains, osteoarchaeologists can analyse the remains that can inform us about the estimate age at death, the estimate sex of the individual, their stature, so how tall they were, but we can also look at other valuable information about past disease, injury, trauma that people may have suffered, so giving us a real insight into the health physique. So further mixture of and skeletal analysis inform us about age and how people were on the landscape through a technique called staples. We can also instruction, delicate mix of science that puts a face to past people, so then we can sort of see maybe what they looked like. DNA analysis can also offer us an insight into human evolution, but also shed light on genetic relationships within a skeletal assemblage. So before we look at the osteoarchaeological analysis, or the evidence, I suppose, that survived from Barrack Street, I'm going to briefly look at some techniques used in the analysis to gain information on the estimate age at death, sex, and stature, and I'm going to touch on some of these aspects throughout the presentation. So some of the most, I suppose, frequent questions we get asked in our profession is, can you tell what age and sex the individual was? How tall were they? And of course, how did they die? What happened to them? So our analysis, I suppose, as osteoarchaeologists can be limited by the burial preservation, completeness of the remains recovered, especially if there's been historic disturbance like Dave explained with skeleton 1 and 6. So we can only base our interpretations on what evidence survives in the burial record, and at any pathological changes or evidence of trauma or disease that leave their mark on the skeletal remains. So to estimate, I suppose, the age at death, we'll just briefly run through a couple of examples. So we would look at different morphological features of the pelvis. So this is the two pelvis bones here. I've just given an example of a female and a male. We'd look in particular at this sort of bony area here called the pubic symphysis. This is sort of where the two halves of the pelvis or your hip bone meet at the front. And we would look also at the auricular surface, which is just here at the base of where the spine joins to the pelvis. So what we're looking for here mainly is age-related morphological changes that can occur through the processes of bone remodeling and also bone degeneration as the individual grows older. So we can also look to estimate the age of individuals at different stages where the bones fuse. So as we are aware, when we are born with 300 bones, and when we reach adulthood, the number of bones is reduced to 206. So some obviously variation can occur, but the intensity of fusion activity is greatest between the ages of 15 and 23 years of age. So for sex determination then, we can also look at morphological features on the pelvis, and here on the slide you can see this area called the sciatic notch. So it's quite wide here in the female example given, whereas it's quite narrow here in the male. So that's sort of an area that we look at for sex determination. Now we also look at the cranium or the skull bones, and we look at different aspects of the skull, so particularly around the chin area here of the mandible. We also look just behind the ear here at an area called the mastoid process. We look at some areas here up at the back of the skull at the occipital bone, and then we look a lot towards the eyes over here as well on the brow ridges. So all these sort of morphological features of the skull is what we would employ in our analysis then to determine sex of the individual. So we also look, I suppose, at metric analysis. So we look at different measurements of the bone. So for example, say the length of a clavicle, which is your collarbone, we would look at those, and we'd look at different diameters of bones both in your lower limbs and your upper arms as well. So from all this information we'd compile it together to make an estimation on estimate sex of the individual. So once we have sort of an estimate age and sex determined then from the remains, we're able to sort of classify them into age categories as well. So we know that younger adults between sort of 18 to 25, and then an older adult would be 45 years plus. So we have different kind of age categories that we determine the age of the individual. So for stature rates then, to see how tall people were in the past, we can look at the long bones. You see here on the slide, there's just an example of the tools we use for measuring. And this is your femur here, so your bone in your thigh bone basically. So we take measurements of that to estimate from the length of it. We can put it through a sort of a mathematical equation, and this gives us a possible stature then for the individual. So that's just a really quick overview of some of the techniques and methodologies we use to figure out the estimate age, death, sex and stature. So back then to looking at the remains from Barrack Street. So as Dave has explained there in great detail about the two different burial types, or the two different burial pits that we found. So we can see here, I've just put up on the slide some of the radiocarbon dates that we received. So we sent samples to Queen's University Belfast. So we sent a sample from skeleton 1 in the first grave and skeleton 5 in the second grave. And you can see there, they're sort of contemporary dates, roughly around the mid-15th to mid-17th century. We can see, as well as Dave explained there, the truncation of the remains in the first grave that we found. And I suppose the remains from skeleton 1, which you can kind of see outlined here, just explain to you a little bit. So we have the femur here, so that's again up on your thigh bone, coming down here, and we have another one just here under the soil. This is sort of mid-excavation shot. And then you can start to see skeleton 6 here coming into view again from the femur bone here as well. But we also see a lot of scattered, disarticulated bone around from the disturbance to the burial as well. So we know from the fragmented remains from skeleton 1 that he survived in an extended supine burial, which means he was laid out on his back. So we can tell that by the way the legs are in the grave. And we also found on excavation some of the left hand situated behind the right pelvis. So we knew at this point there was something strange going on as well in the first burial ground. Or in the first grave, sorry. So on excavation then, we were able to remove the first skeleton and skeleton 6. And from the osteoarchaeological analysis then on skeleton 1, we were able to determine that the individual was a young adult male, aged between 18 to 25 years of age. and the remains of skeleton 6, which were in very poor condition. We weren't able to record, I suppose, the orientation of the burial because of the disturbance to the grave, but we were able to offer an estimate age at death of this individual between 25 and 35 years of age. So we also, as I mentioned there, we had a lot of disarticulated bones scattered around from skeleton 1 and 6, and we had 5 deposits in total recovered from the area, amounting to 127 human bone fragments and 2 human teeth. So what we mean by disarticulated is that the skeleton is not assembled in its anatomical order, so it's presented as loose bones. So to figure out how many individuals may be present among the disarticulated remains, we figured out from the minimum number of individuals, which means we refer to the fewest people, possible number of people in the skeletal assemblage, and it is used to determine then how many people are present in a cluster of bones. So we can conclude from this analysis, from the disarticulated bone, that in fact we have evidence in the form from the right hand bones that indeed we're dealing with another adult individual at this site, so bringing our total from 6 individuals up to 7. So that was an interesting addition to the site from the post-excavation analysis. So the slide here, just to quickly show you, this is a detailed slide from skeleton 1. So here we have the top of the femur, so top of that thigh bone, and this bone here is your pelvis. So you can just see here in situ 3 sort of small bones, and they're highlighted here in the larger slide. So these are actually the left hand of the individual under the right pelvis. So we had, as we say, we had evidence on site that could possibly, sort of give us information that the 2 graves were contemporary, and as we've seen now from the radiocarbon dates, that has confirmed that. So moving on then to the second burial pit, which contained the 4 individuals. So we can see clearly here from sort of this colour coding drawing that you can see the 4 individuals maybe laid out a little bit easier to figure it out. So this is skeleton 2 here in the blue, skeleton 3 in the red, skeleton 4 in the green, and skeleton 5 in the purple. So one of the challenges we had on site was to, I suppose, when we had cleaned back the grave, which one were we going to remove first? So it was a bit of a challenge on site to figure out whose legs were under whose and whose arms were under whose. But once we had figured that out, we were able to know then the order that we would take them out from their archaeological context. So you can see there, I've just put it up here. So the first skeleton to go into the grave was skeleton 5. The second was skeleton 3. The third was skeleton 4. And the 4th final burial was skeleton 2. Okay, so once we've exposed all the remains on site, I suppose in past times what we would have done was gone on to draw the skeletons, each bone in the grave itself. But now with modern technology, we can use photogrammetry and also different drawing packages to bring that information up to us. So it saves an awful lot of time on site. I don't know if MMD would have been happy with us for 2 days on site drawing skeletons. But, and I suppose just to give a shout out to Andy as well in the office in Donegal, he did a great job there from the photographs, bringing us sort of this more, I suppose, public viewing kind of shot as well, that it's easier at talks like this to explain what exactly we did uncover. So the other thing on site that we took as well was we took a lot of soil samples. This is common practice when we excavate any human remains. We would take soil samples from the upper layers as we're coming down to reveal the skeletons, and then we would also take specific targeted kind of soil samples. So for a site like this, obviously we had evidence from the way the bones were positioned that they were definitely going behind the back, and we kind of came to the conclusion they must have been tied. And also maybe that the ankles were. So our soil sampling strategy would have included taking samples at the hands and wrist area, and also down at the ankles and feet. And I suppose at that time as well, when the media attention was high on the site, everyone was saying to us, it must be from the gallows. So we included in our sampling, soil samples, taking samples around the neck area as well, just in case we could record that at that point in the excavation. So I suppose we could start by maybe starting to introduce some of the skeletons. So I'll start with the way we excavated the site. So first of all, we took the individual here who was last to go into the grave, which was skeleton 2, and we started to excavate him first. So you can see here, just to highlight it to you, you can see the arms, so just here coming down and going in under the pelvis, and we have the same here on this side. So it's quite clear that the hands are behind the pelvis area here and going down here to the legs. The feet are very, very close together. They're almost toppled on top of each other, I think, in skeleton 2. So this is why we think possibly as well the feet may have been bound as well. So from the analysis then from skeleton 2, we looked at areas of the pelvis and the skull like I've explained previously, and we were able to come up with an age category for this individual who was an older adult male aged 45 plus. From his stature, so we took a picture or a measurement from the femur bone, and we were able to say that in life he would have stood about 5'5". So not that tall, but not too small either. What else can we tell from the skeletal remains? So we had already identified sort of an estimate age, a sex and stature from the individual. So we looked closer at the bones to see what else we can find. So what we're looking at here on the slide is the sternum. So this up here is your sternum. So you can see it here just in a graphical drawing. And then in kind of situation in your skeleton, so it's your kind of breastbone here. That's the fragment that we had. So we can see also some of the ribs from the individual. So we have 3 ribs here. So your ribs obviously coming from the back of your spine around to the front here that meet up with your sternum. So we noted some pathological changes in the breastbone in the form of raised areas of new bone growth. So normally this bone is quite smooth, but we can see here an awful lot of new bone growth on the surface of the bone. So possibly maybe from some sort of localized infection. And on the ribs, we note areas of porosity down here towards the neck and head of the skeletal remains. So possibly from the porosity, maybe some inflammation, probably associated maybe with early signs of osteoarthritis. So because these are the areas here of the ribs that articulate with the back of the spine, it could be sort of an early detection there of osteoarthritis in the spinal region. So on closer look then at some of the arm bones. So we're looking here at the radius, which is just here one of your lower arm bones, that articulates here with the wrist. So these are the surfaces here that articulate with the wrist. And we can see some real small sort of porosity, little sort of holes in the bone, I suppose, small little holes. And we know from this that it's probably to do with porosity, like degeneration of the bone. So it's probably at the joint as well where you're articulating with the wrist. It's probably sort of some degenerative joint disease starting in that area too. So these can be age related. It can also be sort of, a result of wear and tear in the bone. And as I said, the individual was 45 years plus, so we'd expect to see a little bit of degeneration in that older age category. Moving on then, so we talked about the soil samples that we took, and a very interesting find came from just above skeleton 2 in the soil. You can see here on the slide 2 photos taken under sort of intense magnification. So they appear quite large in the photo, but really they are quite small. And some interesting results from microscopic analysis by Dolores Kearney in UCD, who studies medieval textiles. So she has suggested that the material is identified as animal wool, and under magnification it appears as a mass of fibres laying in a haphazard fashion, and it's been suggested that that may be a fragment of felt. So although she has recommended that further analysis is required for the sample, but we know that felt objects have been found in an Irish context dating to the 15th to 17th century, which fits in, nicely with our time period for the burial context. So, as I say, further analysis is due on this sample, but it's quite an interesting find all the same. You can see here a little close-up shot of when we were excavating skeleton 2. This is his left foot. So you can see here, this is the hallux, or what we say like your big toe, and these are the feet bones here as well. So I suppose what this shows, the level of detail that we can peel back from the excavation, and also I suppose the preservation of skeleton 2 as well. It was quite good. And you can see as well the small little trowels that we would use, a small little plastic trowel here. So very delicate work, really, when you're excavating skeletons. So this is a shot just showing when we, I suppose, removed skeleton 2 from the archaeological context. That's him there, lying up here. So this is just showing it removed from the excavation. So it's quite a detailed excavation to remove one individual at a time. Again, showing it here as well, so maybe it's easier to see in the drawing that the skeleton here has been removed. So I suppose the next skeleton that we excavated was skeleton 4, so lying here in the green outline. So this is the second one. And this individual was aligned in a southwest to northwest orientation, with the skull facing to the northwest. So they were poor to fair preservation, and owing to the effects of water table levels in the area of this grave, the bone was very soft and wet in places, especially around the pelvis and upper limb bones. So we recorded a lot of bone measurements in situ here as to not lose any information when lifting the wet bone. So we can look in more detail of what, oh yeah, that's a better shot of it there. You can just see it here. So this is the skull, this is the spine here, but around the pelvis area, and then we have the legs going down here as well. You can also see the hand, the right hand here going under the pelvis, and we see the evidence here for the left hand coming out by the pelvis as well. So what then, when we looked at the analysis, what do we find interesting from skeleton 4? So as previously mentioned, we've talked about the sort of growth and fusion of the bones and the skeleton that provide us with a parameter for the age at death, because these certain ages, I suppose, are at which the development of the individual's bone of the skeleton occur. So we were able to use some of those techniques here for skeleton 4. So what we're looking at here in the slide is the first one is the clavicle bone, which is your collar bones. The middle one is some rib bones, and this is your sternum back to the breastbone there. So we see that in the 3 of these bones that they aren't fused. So you can see kind of a rugged edge here on the edge of them, and these obviously aren't connected, which they do around the age of 20. They start to fuse. So I suppose it's giving us some information about the individual and how we're going to age the remains. Now we know from the long bones of this individual that they've all fused, and we can go to the kind of metric analysis to see what age the humerus or the femur in that fuses. But we were able to kind of come to the conclusion that this individual was a young adult male, 18 to 25 years of age is the category that we came up with from the analysis. So again, some pathological changes noted in skeleton 4. We're looking here at the upper humerus, so just up here in your upper arm, and we see the sort of bony changes here on the slide. So we know that this is the area where your pectoralis major muscle inserts. So this muscle is located kind of on the anterior surface of your thoracic cage, so it stretches across your upper torso behind the breast area. And the main function, I suppose, of this chest muscle helps you to pull your arm across the front of your body, and it also allows you to rotate your arm. So what we refer to with evidence like this, we call these musculoskeletal markers, and they can be stress markers or occupational markers noted on the bone. So It's obviously some sort of repetitive strain of the muscle on the bone, and we see evidence that the stress marker has also developed on the left side as well of the, you can just kind of see it coming into view there, of the individual as well. But it's definitely stronger from the right side more so than the left. So possibly due to some sort of bone tissue remodeling to do with the use of the muscle, probably from strong physical working activity or strenuous occupation, kind of whatever way they were moving their arms and chest area. So that's an interesting find from skeleton 4. We see here again just on excavation, so some of the bones have been removed, and we can see here quite nicely the 2 arms crossing over each other from skeleton 4. Again, this slide, we're looking when we removed skeleton 4 from the archaeological context, so it would have originally been lying here, so we can see we're just left with 2 individuals in the grave. Again, there you can see just from the illustration, it might be easier to figure out. You can see the bones there of the 2 individuals left. So skeleton 3 was our next skeleton to excavate, so this one up here, or in the red. And we know from the alignment that it was a northeast to southwest orientation, and again a supine position with the skull facing out to the southwest. Based on the width of the grave pit, this individual was leaning slightly on the right side, and the arms, as I say, were flexed again beneath the pelvis. We also see, actually, if I just go back to that slide there, you can see the right leg. All the other individuals, the legs were kind of together. This one here seems to have fallen kind of or flexed out to the side. But again, we see the 2 ankles quite closely back to each other, which would possibly suggest as well that the ankles were bound. So just to talk a little bit about the features that we find. So here we're looking at the left ilium, which is the uppermost part of your hip bone. So when you put your hands on your hips, this is the bone here that you're actually touching. So we looked for, I suppose, on the archaeological remains, we see here that there is a sort of a crest here that fuses to the top of the ilium, and it normally fuses between 17 to 20 years of age, with complete fusion at 23 years. So we can see here that there's been definite fusion of the bone, so it helps us to establish an estimate age of death. We also look again here, you've seen the clavicle before in the previous skeleton, again unfused, that's our collarbone up here. And again, that gives us a clue for estimating age, and also different parts of the ribs. You can see here just sort of a little fusion of the head of the rib, which also gives us an indication of age as well. Now this individual also had quite a significant pathological change noted in the left tibia. So these are your shin bones, I suppose you want to call them. That's the left and that's the right, just to give you comparisons. So you can see here the bone is quite thickened and slightly deformed, and appears to be affected by some infectious process. So there are signs of healing on the bone, and they seem to have been active at the time of death. So I suppose as a weight-bearing bone, this individual may have had some unsteadiness or difficulty with walking, and you can imagine something like this would be quite painful as well. When we look to the upper jaw of this individual, we also see that the 3rd molar, or what we call our wisdom teeth, so these are the 2, first molar, second molar, and 3rd one, we can see that it's impacted, is what we call it. So the tooth is trying to come down, but it's kind of growing off in a horizontal impaction, which seems to have caused by the tooth growing in an angled position away from the normal vertical position. So it's been pushing on the 2nd root here, we can just see in the slide. So it has nowhere to go really, but it's trying to erupt. I'd say again quite painful. So between this individual's probably maybe healed fracture in the tibia and this tooth as well, it would have caused quite a lot of pain. Here we see a bit of a shot of just the excavation again when we came down to skeleton 3's hands. Nicely there, you can see they're quite crossed over at the wrist area. And again, I suppose when we talked about taking soil samples, we would have taken, once we'd removed the bone, we would have taken quite a large soil sample from this area here. And it provided us with a small sort of organic kind of type of material in the soil sample once we processed it. So you can see here again, this is under severe magnification. It's really quite a small piece. And again, we sent the sample off to Dolores Kearney in UCD, and she has suggested that it may be indicative of a rope-like fibre, but again, further analysis has been recommended. She did detect what appears to be vegetable fibres and some type of naturally occurring plant matter. And there also seems to be a human hair in the sample. So you can see just here, it's quite magnified, but that's actually a human hair. So again, we're hoping to get some finer analysis conducted on the sample, but I suppose it is an exciting find, and obviously, you know, it's found right in the position of skeleton 3's hands that were bound together, so perhaps it is maybe something to do with fabric or the connection between what the hands were tied with. So we're waiting further analysis on that one. So then for here we see that the individual has been removed from the archaeological context, and we're just left with one skeleton remaining, skeleton 5. So this individual is aligned in a southwest to northwest orientation with the skull facing to the northwest. And we can tell from the position of the individual that it's almost lying what we call in a prone position, which means it's lying to the front, so on its kind of stomach area there. And we can see, you know, the hands here clearly behind the back, coming down behind the pelvis region there. It was in pretty fair condition, the bones. Again, we hit a bit of a water table issue with this individual. The bones were quite wet and soft around the pelvis and femur area. So again, we took a lot of measurements on site to make sure we didn't lose any information. We know from the pelvis from this individual that he was 45 years plus, and from the morphology of the cranium, the pelvis, the metric analysis, we can determine that the individual was male. And from the left femur, we can tell that the height was about 5'3". So any pathologies that we noted from skeleton 5, we can look at some of the dentition. So slight to moderate dental calculus, or what we call calcified plaque, is one of the most frequent forms of, I suppose, dental disease noted on archaeological remains. On skeleton 5, we see on the lower dentition, so this is on your lower mandible, we see here in a close-up shot quite large amounts of calculus on the teeth. We also see along the rim of the teeth here, we see what we call periodontal disease, which is inflammation of the gums, also known as gingivitis. So we also see a large caries here in the dentition, so a large hole in the enamel of the tooth, which was recorded on the left first molar, and we also see evidence of caries on this tooth from this slide here. Sorry, this is the first molar, and the second molar here seems to be worn right down to the actual root. So we see from here that it's probably caused. That's probably what caused the large caries here in the tooth. So to be just in here in this area here. We can see up here as well a lot of infection in the bone. So obviously something like that would cause a lot of infection in your gum. So again, quite a painful thing to have in your dentition. And I'll return, I suppose, to the research value of looking at the dentition on this individual. I'll return to a little bit about that towards the end. So this is just the photo of the actual grave itself with all the remains removed from the archaeological context. And I suppose if we just summarise, I suppose, from the individuals that we spoke about. So from the 2 burial pits, the evidence of 7 adult individuals at this site, 6 of which we know from the analysis are male. The age of death profiles include 3 younger adults, so skeleton 1, 3 and 4, age at death 18 to 25 years, one middle-aged adult, skeleton 6, aged 25 to 35, and 2 older adults, age of death 45 years. And in terms then of dental pathologies, we've had evidence for the calculus, periodontal disease and caries. And in terms of the pathological changes noted on the bone, we had examples of a possible healed or healing fracture, degenerative joint disease, and some occupation-related degenerative changes on the bone. So, in terms, I suppose, of both graves uncovered, what happened to these individuals discovered on the site of the former Nancy Spain's pub? We know from the archaeological evidence and from the orientation and burial positions that there was an obvious lack of respect afforded in the time preceding and during the deposition of the 7 individuals. Clear evidence from this larger grave illustrates that the individuals were buried within a cramped and shallow mass burial pit. So no care was really taken on burial to even untie the hands or the feet. So this could be suggestive that they were buried very close to the site of where they died. The period of death, I suppose, for the individuals indicated by the radiocarbon dates, we have the mid-15th to mid-17th centuries, and we know that this was a turbulent time in Irish history. Within the Cork area, the focus of several military-style conflicts. So we had the first Desmond Rebellion of 1569 to 1573, the second Desmond Rebellion from 1579 to 1583, and then we had the 9-Year War from 1593 to 1603, which culminated in the Battle of Kinsale and a revolt in Cork City in 1603, subsequent to the death of Elizabeth I. This revolt saw, I suppose, the burning down of the original Elizabeth IV, which was only located about 80 metres from the burial site. So were these individuals, I suppose, prisoners of war or prisoners of some sort of military-style conflict? And we know the prisoners of war are a product of the war or conflict and represent an unusual category of the detained in that they are normally fit, law-abiding and imprisoned only because of their allegiance in a conflict. So we know from the Irish archaeological record then that the traditional burial form from the 4th to 5th century with the arrival of Christianity is to be buried in a west to east orientation with your head to the west. So as discussed, the orientation of these individual graves was not aligned in such a way. So such burial activity at the site of Barrack Street seems to suggest that they experienced some outbreak of violence and were buried in a rushed or hurried fashion, which may reflect, I suppose, a hasty burial indicative of conflict. So what about further research then on the individuals? So I suppose the media coverage of the site attracted all sorts of attention, and one contact that was very positively made was from Dr. Susan Flavin of Trinity College Dublin. So Susan is the principal investigator of the Food Cult Project, which is a 5-year funded research project by the European Research Council. So this project promotes an interdisciplinary approach using history, archaeology and scientific methods to explore the diet and foodways of diverse communities during the period from 1550 to 1650 in Ireland. So they were interested in looking at including the remains from Barrack Street in their research project, and we've provided them with samples of teeth and bone to conduct calculus and stable isotope analysis. So this was a fantastic opportunity to become involved in their project and gain a more in-depth analysis of the diet of these individuals. So at the moment, I think the samples are with them presently, so we're waiting on the analysis to come through. But they're employing 2 different types of analysis. Firstly, stable isotope techniques conducted by Professor Janet Montgomery and Dr. Alice Rose from Durham University in the UK. And this is based on the principle that human bodily tissues will reflect the isotope composition of the food and water that we ingest during our lifetimes. So basically, I suppose you are what you eat. And this analysis, by looking at different isotope ratios in the teeth and bone, will inform us about the diet of the individuals and possibly how mobile they may have been on the landscape during their lifetime as well. Secondly, thinking back to the slide I showed you there from Skeleton 5 with the calculus deposits, Dr. Robert Power in UCD will investigate this, the dental calculus to understand plant consumption and how plants may have contributed to the diet of these individuals at a micro level. So both techniques will offer us potential information on where these individuals may have been sourcing their food and what type of food they may have been eating. So it's a very interesting research project to be involved in. And I suppose a project like this often culminates in publication and dissemination of the findings, like we are doing here tonight in a public lecture. And I'm sure once all the results are complete, there will be more talks and publications probably associated with the archaeological findings from Barrack Street. And from a conservation and curatorial aspect, we will be preparing the skeletal remains to be housed by the National Museum of Ireland in the coming months. And this is an important aspect of the project, as firstly, I suppose, by depositing the human remains to the National Museum, this prevents any loss of information, and it prevents breakages by handling and storing the material properly in an environmentally controlled storage area. And secondly, it becomes a provision for research access to the collection. So I suppose with advances in technology, who knows what the future will bring in to the field of archaeological science. And I suppose DNA analysis would be very interesting to look at for these individuals based on, I suppose, their age profiles. Were they genetically related to each other? So that's maybe a project for the future. So I'll leave it at that because I'm conscious I've probably gone way over time. So on behalf of myself and Dave, we would like to thank Rose and the library staff, all of you who came here tonight, and of course those of you who are tuned in online. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we would also like to thank all those who have offered their expertise with different elements of the project. So thank you.